Okay, well, welcome and good afternoon, everyone. We're going to get started. Just to introduce myself, I'm Besa Luce. I'm the chief editor of Kosovo 2.0, and please allow me to welcome everyone to the last day of Hope Media Carnival. For those of you who have had the opportunity to also follow some of the events physically here with us while respecting social distancing rules, but also many more that have been joining us throughout the past 3 days online. I truly hope that these days have served as a moment to reflect and engage in dialogue. I hope that our media carnival has inspired us, but I also hope it has provoked us to understand how hope interplays with our quest and drive for a just society, how hope can fuel different forms of dissent and advocacy to mark our presence, but also the ways that we need to be wary of hope and the dangers of hope if it comes without agency. Before we continue to introducing tonight's closing event, I would just like to also take the time to thank our donors who have also made the past four days possible. So the Hope Media Carnival is supported by the European Union Office in Kosovo, the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, through a grant managed by Kosovar Civil Society Foundation, Prince Claus Fund, Rockefeller Brothers Fund, and Kosovo Foundation for Open Society. So tonight's closing event is called Outloud Talks, and it's another format through which we're seeking to serve as a space to inspire and provoke, but also foster dialogue and reflection on the current state of our societies. We will have 4 exceptional speakers connecting to us online today, and I will be leading the first two discussions. I would like just to let everybody know that we will be on quite a tight schedule, and we will also try for every speaker to leave some time at the end to take a couple of questions. So now to get it started. And with regard to the first speaker, this is someone who has had a huge influence on me. She's a former professor of mine from whom I have taken away an incredibly important lesson for being a journalist. That is that behind every story that we hear, read, or listen to, there are countless of other stories that go untold. And those are the voices and experiences we should seek to understand and explore and to bring to the forefront of journalistic storytelling. So I'm very pleased to have the opportunity now to introduce her. And she's Jacqui Banaszynski, an award-winning journalist and an emerita professor at Missouri School of Journalism and faculty fellow at the world-renowned Poynter Institute. She also serves as editor of Nehme Storyboard, a global website which celebrates and examines the art and craft of narrative journalism. Jacqui is also a Pulitzer Prize winner in feature writing for her 1988 series AIDS in the Heartland, following the life of a gay couple at a time when both LGBTQ identities and AIDS were highly taboo in American society, and also beyond, with little information and few stories available. Over the years, her newspaper career has taken her to all 7 continents, including Antarctica. She has written about corruption and crime, beauty pageants and popes, labor strikes and political strife, traffic fatalities and family tragedies, to name a few. Jacqui, it is so wonderful to have you here today, to be able to see you again and also to speak with you. Jacqui will be talking to us about how journalism is a daily act of hope. I will pass now the word to Jacqui, following which we will also continue with our Q&A session.
Hi, Besa. Can everyone hear me? Okay. Hi. It's wonderful to be invited to be with you. I wish I was with you in person. It's morning here in Seattle. I'm in my home and have my iced coffee. But I would much prefer to be with you in person so I could spend some real time with you. And we could have some coffee or a glass of wine and talk for a long, long time so I could find out more about your challenges and your hopes, because that's what this job is all about, and that's what I think life is all about. We don't have much time, so I'm going to try to be fairly direct in what I want to talk about. I started this morning, I had a plan, and then I started this morning and I made the mistake of reading the news, which I do every morning. And the news these days is pretty discouraging in the US. You in Kosovo are no strangers to hard news and challenging news, and that's true around the world. In the US, we've been hit especially hard recently with that news. Part of that news today involved a story apart from politics, which, if you get me down the road of politics, will never stop. But there was a story in the New York Times Sunday magazine by Dan Barry, who's one of my favorite writers, favorite reporters. and favorite people. He's a charming man. If you have access to the New York Times at all, I suggest you find it. It's a story about a guy named Evan Brandt. He is the only reporter left at a newspaper in a town of 25,000 in Pennsylvania. And Barry's story takes you through Brandt's day and his history and his life, and also the life of this town. And the reason it struck me was because it's a beautiful, beautiful piece of writing. Barry is indeed one of the best. It's an artful piece of writing, but it's also a really heartfelt story about the power and the purpose of journalism and what we're losing in the US in terms of the contraction of local journalism, the people who go to the school board meetings and the town council meetings and cover the obituaries, all the work that I started out doing. That doesn't sound very hopeful, but I'll get back to that because there is hope in that story. I did start that way. I'm just going to tell you a couple of stories about my career that I hope echo this notion that Besa mentioned about journalism being a daily act of hope, which I really believe it is. I don't think you can do this work unless you have hope for the purpose of that work and for society getting together and making good decisions and solving its own problems. So when I tell you this story, it happened 35 years ago. I know many of you are young women in the audience. I was 32 years old, and I was working at a paper in Minnesota. And I was very insecure about what I was doing and whether I was any good and whether I had chosen the right thing to do for my career, because I never found it easy. And I looked around me and everybody else seemed to have some secret formula that made it look easy, and I was always nervous. I finally had worked my way to the point where I was going to be assigned to cover the state government, state legislature. And we were in the state capitol as a newspaper, and no woman had ever covered the state legislature. Now, that may seem odd to you, but this was 35 years ago, and women in the newsroom were still a little bit odd. We weren't always welcome. We had to fight to get the right assignments. So I had battled my way to the point where I was going to cover the state legislature, and this was going to be the big step up in my career. It's what all of the traditional reporters did to succeed. And I had this goal of someday covering the White House or the Supreme Court. Then we started hearing news of the big famine in Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa, Ethiopia, Sudan. And my editor called me in around Christmas. I think I was off for a few days, and she called me in, and I was supposed to start my new job covering state government in about a week. And she called me in and she said, "There's a famine in Africa." I said, "Yeah, I watch the news, I know." And she said, "I want to send somebody." I'm like, "We're a small paper in the Midwest. Why would we go and cover a famine in Africa?" Well, there happened to be a relief organization that was based in St. Paul, the town I was in, that was going to send a group of people to work this famine. And she says, "I want to go." My editor was very ambitious. She's the best editor I've ever had, a woman who 11 years older than me and fought all the wars in astonishing ways to get women their role in the newsroom. And she said, "I want to send you." And I was like, gulp. And she said, "But the problem is, if you go to Africa, you can't cover the legislature. You have to make a choice, and you have to make it by tomorrow morning." So I went home and I had a long talk with myself, because my big dream was this route up the ladder. And I thought, the legislature's always going to be there, and Africa might never come around again. So the next day, I took my courage in my hand and I went in and I said, "I'll go." So she sent me and another young woman, photographer, who was even a year or two younger than me. Neither of us had ever been out of the country. Sudan at the time was considered one of the two hardest places to be in the world. It's very dangerous, very poor. And we had no idea what we were doing. All of the big news organizations were covering this story. It was a massive, massive international story. And I got there, and 2 weeks in, I was completely overwhelmed. This is when we reached the crucible of this story, because as I was there, I started to realize I didn't belong in journalism. that I had nothing to offer and that I wasn't good enough to compete with the other news organizations. And I also really questioned the value of what I was doing. And the reason I did that was because day after day after day, I would watch people die. I would watch funerals of babies. I would walk around the refugee camps, the famine camps that we were in, and I'd see people struggling to survive. And I kept wondering what I could do that made a difference. And then one day I was in a clinic, just a makeshift clinic. There were long, long lines of people waiting to see doctors. Most of them had children with them. The children were sick. Nobody was crying. It's the oddest thing in the world to see people struggle and not make much noise. It's hot. These people were standing for hours. And at one point I was just walking and watching and taking notes, and this man came up to me and he had a child in his hands. And the child was so sick that his rectum had failed, and so his intestines were coming out of his rectum. And the man held the baby up to me as if he wanted me to take it. And I realized in that moment that he thought that since I was a tall, relatively clean, given the circumstances, white person, I must have been a doctor and I must have been able to fix something. And I stood there and all I had was a notebook and a pencil. And I felt absolutely ashamed of what I was doing. So I spent the next few days just sort of trying to cope. And I would go at night. We stayed in this little hut and slept on cots, Jean, my photographer partner, and I. And it was pitch dark. If you've ever been to Africa, there's no light pollution, so it is dark. And I would lay there and I was hungry and I was scared, and I would hear this odd sound, and I couldn't figure out what it was because it sounded like singing, and I couldn't imagine anybody singing. And there were 100,000 people in this camp, and I'd hear them coughing, I'd hear them dying, I'd hear them defecating, I'd hear some of them making love, which was interesting. And I heard this singing. So after 2 or 3 days, I finally asked someone about it. He was somebody from there, and he was a relief worker who was working with the Americans. And he said, oh, yes, they bring their songs. I said, well, what do you mean they bring their songs? When these people in Ethiopia had to leave their villages because there was no more food and the planes, the bombs were coming, there was a civil war on at the time, they would pick up what they had, a blanket, a pot, their babies, and they would walk 3 days to 3 weeks to get to a refugee camp in Sudan where they had heard there was medicine and water. And one of the things that they always brought with them were stories. And every night they would sit down together and they would gather the children around in their communities, what was left of them that they had recreated in this refugee camp. And they would sing to the children. And what they were singing were their stories. They were singing their history, they were singing culture, they were singing religion, they were singing values, they were singing their hope about the future. And I realized then, after another few weeks of writing and having the public respond to this story and thinking over and over and over again about that moment, that what I was doing did matter. And that if this group of people who were facing the worst circumstances ever, circumstances I couldn't imagine living through, and one of the things they treasured and wouldn't let go of were their stories, then what I wanted to do was be a storyteller. So I ditched the whole idea of covering politics and the Supreme Court and all that. I mean, I still did that kind of work, but as a career track, I took a turn. And I took a turn in a way that made stories the center of what I tried to do. And at the center of that was listening to people, listening for their stories, listening for their version that changes culture by culture by culture of the songs that they hold on to and pass along. And as a result, I have done pretty much nothing in the rest of my career, but try to find those stories, as Besa said, that are underneath the news that we cover. Again, I've covered news because I stayed at community newspapers, regional papers, because I wanted to write for an audience, for people I knew, for people I lived with. But but the stories were what kept me going. Now, a friend of mine, I'll just close here real quickly and then we can turn it over to questions. I'm part of a writers group. I teach a writing workshop once a year in Arizona. And some of the people from the workshops over the years had decided they wanted to keep working together and with me. So they created a community. There's about 12 to 15 of them, and they meet every other week on Zoom. They've been doing it for 2 or 3 years now. And after my new workshops in Arizona, they fly down and we spend a weekend together talking. One of the women in the group is not a writer by trade. She's a therapist. And so she tends to kind of lead us in these discussions. And she does this thing called roses and thorns. So when we get together, we each have to present from the last week a rose, something good in our life, something happy, something hopeful. Then we have to present a thorn, some challenge. And it's, it's a gimmick. It's one of those therapist gimmicks, but it works because it gives us a frame. I flip it around and I always start with a thorn because I think I don't want to start with the downer. I want to lead to the upside. And what I've learned over the years is that you can't separate the rose and the thorn. So back to Evan Brandt really, really quickly. So Evan is 55 or 59 years old or something. He's worked at this paper for a long time. And he is now the last standing reporter at this newspaper because it's been sold to a hedge fund and it's been gutted and gutted and gutted for profits. And he literally is the only reporter who covers a town of 25,000 and all of these other people around it in these other communities. It was a discouraging story in many ways because it gets at the threat to American newspapers and what that means to American democracy. But in it, I found threads of hope because Evan Brandt, bless his heart, keeps writing. He keeps going to the school board meetings. He keeps going to the city council meetings. He keeps going to the little community events where people are trying to feed each other during COVID. He won't quit. So he works out of his attic. He's a one-man newsroom. And Evan's going to get like a box of like food from me or something. Maybe I'll send him a pizza. We always send pizza to journalists in the US. And so there was a downer there, a thorn, but there's also this rose. And the rose is that people keep doing this work because they believe in it. I want to leave you with 5 little points that I think are my thorns and roses. One is that as contracted as journalism is right now, half of the newsroom jobs in the United States have been lost in the last 10 years, fully half. More and more people want to do this work. More and more young people want to do this work because they're waking up and they're realizing that there are stories to tell and they want a voice and they're doing it differently than my generation, but I think that's a good thing. In the US, you will see women and minorities standing up in newsrooms and saying, we want a voice and we want it to be our voice. We don't want to have the institutional white male voice thrust upon us. There are also more platforms for doing journalism than ever before. Look at how we're getting together. I didn't have to get on a plane to come to Kosovo, although I would have liked to do that. So there are ways to do that, and there are more and more people who want to do it. 2, I think the world, at least the world I know in the US, has a broken heart right now. We're watching the American experiment of democracy challenged to the point maybe of failing. I don't know if we'll get through this. Again, other countries and cultures like yours have gone through that already. We haven't really since the Civil War and then civil rights, and now we are. I don't know how it's going to turn out. So I think a lot of people have broken hearts. My generation, I talk to friends, and there are a lot of broken hearts. But I also realize, and here's the rose, when your heart is broken, it's cracked open. And when your heart is cracked open, it can hear more things and it can be more open to other possibilities and it can listen better. And so I keep trying to say, wait a minute, we've cracked open this hard shell of what we thought we were, and we have a possibility to listen and hear stories and be even better. 3, I think, and I know there are a lot of women in the audience, it's interesting because when I look back on my career, I think this is a really good time for women because the kind of work we need to do leans on the way women kind of naturally lead. And I don't want to get into gender generalizations, but women listen. They make space. They work together in teams. It's been shown over and over and over in research studies. It's just natural. And that's what the world needs right now. And that's what journalism needs. Even in politics, in the US, the women and the women of color who are lined up to take power, if they're allowed, they won't be under the Trump administration. They would be under the Biden administration, are astonishing. Their talents are astonishing. And what women, especially young women now have to offer is the world is ready for it and needs it. 5, one of the things that gives me great hope is the fact that you all are here. So this alone is a hopeful sign to me, because you wouldn't be getting together and talking and trying to find your path forward if you didn't care about this. If you didn't have that spark or that flame that said, I want to do this and I want to make a difference in my life and I want to do it through some version of storytelling. And that gives me very great hope. So thank you so, so much for that. Last thought, and then we'll go to questions. Several years ago, I was in Finland and somebody asked me about the challenges to the news industry. And things were far better then than they are now, but they felt bad. And I remember saying something out of the blue that I held on to and I believe in, and that's that storytelling, like that situation I ran into in Africa, is universal. It crosses all boundaries, and we have done it since man first picked up a bit of ochre and scratched on a rock somewhere, started telling the stories of his community and of his life and his world. And we will still be doing it when we find a way to write on the stars. And so no matter what happens and what forces work against us, I think that notion of holding on to the hope of stories and knowing that every day, if you do that work, you're adding hope to the world just by listening to it is a worthy way to spend your life.
Jacqui, a round of applause. For me, it's always what I've always found so wonderful and encouraging coming from you is that you really make us remind us of the things that are so vital, so essential, but that sometimes we take for granted. And I think listening is one of those. We take listening for granted. And in one way, I think also the crisis of democracy today is because there's this absence of listening to one another. There's this absence of representation. You touched about the political climate in the US, but not just there, everywhere. There's a rise of political populism, there's increased polarization within our societies, more and more attempts to divide people. So listening becomes even more important. So what would you say to younger storytellers and to those people that you described in today's newsroom? How should they use listening as a tool to make sure that they're also being compassionate, recognizing the divisions, but also looking at other ways of how stories can unite us?
Right. This is going to sound counterintuitive, but I think the first thing you have to do is not be afraid of the questions that you ask, because some people shy away from questions because they feel like a challenge or a conflict. And I think you have to be willing to ask questions of people. And I have found that you can do that and you can ask people anything as long as you are asking it sincerely and then if you're open to their answer. And so just wading into the world and saying, tell me about yourself, help me understand. I don't have that experience. Can you help me walk in your shoes a little bit? And then truly listening. Listening is a gift. We don't do it very well. And one of the things that I've always told young reporters who are shy or hesitant about it is that they're not taking time from people if they ask them questions and sit with them in an interview. They're actually giving them the gift of attention and time. But we have to be willing to do that and to go through the discomfort because sometimes it's very, very uncomfortable. We also have to set aside our own projections and assumptions. So I can come to Europe to the old Eastern Bloc. I can go to China, I can go to Africa, and it's natural for me to project my Western narrative. It's also a mistake because then I'm not listening to how other people live their lives, and I'm not hearing how we're similar, how we're different, and how we might move those two things forward. So you have to be willing to go through the discomfort. You have to set aside your own assumptions, and you have to shut up and listen and just tell people, help me understand. I really want to learn.
And you've been teaching for years now, journalism students, and we are aware, and you touched upon some of the difficulties and the challenges that journalism has been going through. Unfortunately, today, the value of journalism sometimes tends to be counted by clicks or by the revenue that it brings back, and not by the value of the impact that it might have in people's lives and in societies. So how do you think the process of listening has changed throughout generations? If you look at your journalism students, are they more or less prone to listening in this fast information world, but also within the industry itself? Is there enough space for journalists to take the time to do the type of storytelling that can truly have an impact in people's lives?
That's an excellent question, and that is a real that's a real challenge, because in newsrooms, young people who are being hired because they have digital skills and they're cheaper, they're less expensive than a veteran, they're being pushed to chase clicks and to report online and to not be in the field. I think even if you take, I don't mean to be a Pollyanna about this because it is a challenge, but even if you take an extra 2 to 3 minutes on any story you're doing and think about what possibilities there are and who are the people behind that story, and then get on the phone and ring them up or reach out by email, you can do that. You can find your own path through, and then if you do enough of that kind of work, pretty soon that kind of work is going to get you noticed. I'm really fascinated with this project or this team they have at the Washington Post called the Morning Mix. There's young people, they're entry level, and they sit overnight on the desk at the Washington Post, and they scour social media. And they look for stories, and then they write them up the next morning. And I was very skeptical of that when I first saw it, because it just felt to me like regurgitating things and being kind of glib. It was like clickbait, because they were finding fun, odd stories. The oldest spider in Australia or something. But when I went and met with them and talked with them, I realized that they were figuring out how to be the reporters of the future, because they could see, the good ones could see the possibilities of stories in all of the white noise that came their way. And so many of the biggest names right now, young talents at the Washington Post, started there. So it's a matter of how you approach the job. The thing you've got to remember these days is that nobody's going to reach out, and very few people are going to reach out, take your hand, and pull you forward and pull you up. So what you want to do is look for the people who won't get in your way, and then go forward yourself. And you want to create a community. It's why I mentioned this group of women who I work with, who used to be in my writing workshop. They have created their own community. They help each other. And they're not waiting for an editor to make things work for them. They're doing that themselves. And I think part of that is listening, saying, who can help me? Part of that is listening to yourself and saying, what do I need? And then it's getting off your ass, frankly, and doing it.
I want to go back to the story that you shared with us about the time when you went to Africa to cover the famine. And I think it's so important to also share these moments when we have a loss of confidence or value over our work. And because I think it really touches on this thin line between getting the trust of the subject that you're covering, especially as a storyteller, and it's particularly in immersion journalism, but also the responsibility as a journalist to remain committed, but somehow also detached. So there's a thin line in that. And how have you navigated through this throughout your experiences, and also how have you guided your students in this?
Yeah, that's also a good and big question. Some people aren't wired to do that kind of thing. I have dear friends who wouldn't have been able to go to Africa because it would have just broken them. It was too hard. I have some odd ability to kind of detach without not caring. I care deeply. But my notebook kind of becomes that shield. I lead with curiosity. I always want to know more and understand more. And so that becomes its own sort of protection from just falling apart emotionally. And over, I recognize it's not about me. So the goal is the story. The goal is to hear the other person. The goal is to help them tell their story. And until you sit and ask about their story and listen to it, a lot of people have never been asked to tell their story before. So I would walk through these camps in Africa and I'd sit with people and they were honored I was there to say, tell me about your life. Tell me what happened to you. Tell me about your family. And they would make room and they would make time and they wanted someone to talk to. So one of the things to recognize that's going on now is that people are in this time of isolation, people are really hungry to talk. Not all of them, but I'm seeing a difference. And so you got to have a support system around you, but mostly what you have to do is understand the purpose of what you're doing and believe in it. And if you believe the purpose is to listen to other people, to try to understand other people, and to help them tell their story so you can share it appropriately, you will keep yourself in that balance of compassion and detachment.
I would just like to remind everyone that we will have time for a few 1-2 questions. So if there is one question now from the audience, or if we have a question online. If not, I'm giving you some time to also think about it, and I will then just continue with the next question. And I would like to talk a bit also what is happening right now in the U.S. politically, and I think with the Black Lives Matter protest, because we're witnessing a movement that is not only shaking up the systems that have maintained racism in the U.S., but it's also inspiring and triggering protests and discussions elsewhere. For example, in Kosovo, it has led to this increased discussion over the oppression and discrimination of minority groups here, and minority groups of colors. So I think there's hope in this stronger interconnectedness between movements in the local and global communities. So what stories should we be paying attention to right now that potentially risk going unreported or untold? So how do we remain alert to tell the stories that don't make it in the headlines, especially when there's the protests and there's a lot of also anger? What are the stories that we should make sure that we're not letting go out of sight?
Yeah, the challenge of that is there are so many of them, and people are finally ready to tell them. When Trump was running for office in the first, and then he won because people were so surprised, there was all this sudden, oh my God, from the American press that says, we got to go out and talk to Trump supporters. We got to understand why they're so angry. We've got to understand why evangelical Christians would support this guy. And that is important, but we were leaving out a whole lot of people who we just assumed. We made assumptions. And so the stories I'm interested in these days are the stories of not only why I look at two movements, at Me Too and then Black Lives Matter, and everything else is wrapped up in that. But I really want to understand how they see their lives and how they view things going on that are different than the way I do. And so the question of white privilege, which we're wrestling with a lot in this country, I think requires that we not only do the stories about the psychology of white privilege and what that means and all the research studies, which are fascinating, but just listening to people. So I'd love to be sitting with one of those young reporters from the New York Times who's taken on the paper itself internally, same with the Washington Post, and said, there's no place for us. We're a woman, we're a minority, whatever, there's no place for us here. Why do they feel that way? What would they have different? How would they coordinate that with traditional journalistic values? What would their voice look like? And we often don't give them time. We ask them glib questions, but we just don't really give them time to say, so what would you do? Tell us. Let's have a conversation about why you think this is wrong and what you would do about it. And we can't promise the answer, but we'll listen. So I don't think right now it's hard to find those stories. I think it's hard to figure out where to start because there are so damn many of them. I would also be listening to young people, but I'd want to put them together with old people and have them talk to each other. I think going into, and National Public Radio is actually doing a very good job of this. They're going into places and finding minorities, usually women minorities, who are in what we consider traditional high-end jobs. Yesterday, they had a long interview with a physician who is in a COVID ward in one of the poorest parts of the nation. They didn't talk to her because she was a token voice. They let her tell her entire life story, including why she ended up doing this work and what it means to her. And I learned a lot about her journey as a young black woman who went into med school, and why she was committed to staying in a poor part of the country. And there was nothing cliched about it. It was really a rich piece. So listening to the fuller stories that we usually just glance by really quickly, I think is the key right now. It's not finding them, it's spending time with them.
Thank you. I would just like to see if there are any questions from people present. Yes, we have one question over there.
Thank you. Thank you, Jacqui. It's been really inspiring to listen to you. And actually, it resonated a lot what you said about working through that story in Africa with a famine and finding yourself useless maybe to the circumstance and the situation, and maybe finding journalism is not what is needed now, perhaps. And this resonated with me now because I feel like during the pandemic and in this situation of quarantine and lockdown, there's been a lot, I think, that there might have been a lot of that loss of confidence in the profession on what it can offer or what we can actually do. When you see that what is needed is doctors, what is needed is nurses, what is needed is psychological support and help. So I wonder if you've had that conversation about this loss of confidence during this pandemic, and where do you see the role of journalism going towards in this whole context where, yes, information is needed, but do we need to rethink the way we're doing our jobs now?
Yeah, I want to add something to that. You gave a really good list of the things that we need now. We need doctors, we need psychologists, we need mental health support. We also need the truth. And that's where the journalist comes in. And are we going to be beloved for it? You know, years ago when I was in the newsroom, I was sent an assignment that was really hard, and I knew it would make other people in the newsroom, my colleagues, angry. And so I resisted, and my editor looked at me and he said, "We did not hire you to win a popularity contest. We hired you to do your damn job and to do it well." I was like, whoa, okay. And the message was, you know, you're not here to be liked by your colleagues. That's nice, and you know, we don't want you to be an asshole, but you're here to do the job that the public needs. And the public right now needs truth. And yes, it gets discouraging to be criticized and pissed on and all this kind of stuff. Sorry, pardon my language. But I think if you just keep saying over and over, we have to tell the truth. The one thing I would encourage you to hold on to is, even if people aren't listening today, we have to have that record of truth for the future. So imagine, if you will, what would have happened if we didn't have any record of World War II and the Holocaust. Imagine the holes in the story that your families lived during the Balkan crisis and the Balkan Wars. I don't know that full truths were told there, and I think we need to know them. So the role that journalists play right now in the pandemic is constantly to sort out the truth from the spin. And that means the spin from the doctors, the spin from the politicians, this whole war over politics. We need science journalists who understand how germs work and how they don't, and how tests work. And then we need to put it out there, listen to the public, find out what else they want to know. And then we need to just accept the fact that telling the truth is enough. And eventually it will find its way. But if we're expecting to get a big smooch at the end of the day from the public, it's not going to happen. Not going to happen.
Thank you so much, Jacqui. And I think that was a great note to end with, that even if nobody's listening today, we have to remember that it will go as a record for the future. And I think that's so important for journalism. I would like to thank you again for being here with us, in the morning for you, in the afternoon with us, and to ask everybody for a round of applause. And it was great to see you as well.
Yeah, great to see you. Take care, everyone, and do good work. Keep the faith. It's worth it.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Just to let everybody know, and everybody also following online, that we will take 1-2 minutes before we introduce the next speaker. So I just ask you to patiently wait as we set up. Thank you. Okay, well, we will continue with the next speaker, and we will continue with our Outloud talks. And now it is truly an utmost honor and with great pleasure to have the opportunity to introduce our next guest, the acclaimed and award-winning British novelist, Elif Shafak. Elif is the most widely read female author in Turkey, but her words, characters, and perspectives, they transcend and they resonate with readers far beyond. Writing in both Turkish and English, she has published 17 books, 11 of which are novels, and her work has been translated into 50 languages, including in the Albanian language here in Kosovo, where she is truly very widely read. And besides being a renowned storyteller and novelist, she's also an academic, a political activist, a feminist, and a human rights advocate, with women, LGBTQ rights, and freedom of speech at the center of her advocacy. Elif, thank you so much for accepting our invitation and for being with us here today.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm very excited. Thank you.
The conversation today is grounded on the sentiment of hope, and I would like to mention how a few years ago you were described as an author, quote unquote, who will give you a much needed lift of the heart. And I chose to mention this because I believe it's a feeling that we are much in need of today, particularly during this pandemic that we're going through, whether in our more local communities and also in the more global setting. So it's a time that feels as if there's a lot of uncertainties, both on an individual level, but also there's a lot of political uncertainties. So within this context, what is hope for you today? Yeah,
thank you so much. I really think it's such an important question. But But I also believe that it's okay to feel sad. It's okay to feel worried. It's okay. Actually, it's good to feel angry as well, because it shows that we are engaged, that we care, that we respond. So rather than trying to delete these emotions, I want to channel these emotions into something more positive. In that sense, I'm interested in the combination of pessimism and optimism. To me, that is a healthier way. I think the mind, the brain needs to be a bit more pessimistic, because if we really follow what's happening all around the world today, there are lots of inequalities, injustices that we should be concerned about. And that makes our minds a bit more pessimistic. But the heart, the human heart, needs to be more optimistic. And the Italian thinker Antonio Gramsci used to talk about this. He used to talk about the pessimism of the intellect and optimism of the will, optimism of the heart. And I think that is a good combination. So I find hope in my fellow human beings when we talk, when we connect across borders, across national borders, when we understand each other, when we realize how similar we are. There's a lot of hope and optimism in that. But I think we need a healthy dose of pessimism in addition. It's better to combine both.
Okay. Well, you mentioned a bit in the pessimistic sense, or the anger that we might have towards a lot of injustices around us. And I also think that they're related to the many ways in which our democracies have been in decay and they're becoming more and more fragile. And maybe the pandemic has also just exposed the fragility even more. Do you think that there's also risks of further isolating ourselves in our bubbles, be it political or cultural, as a result of the pandemic? And how can we strive for a post-pandemic context, one where maybe we also don't accept to go back to the normality where right now we're so eager to go back to? Can we strive to go to something different?
Indeed, and I think you are so right. Sometimes people with all the good intentions, they say, when will we be able to go back to the normal, to how things were before the pandemic? But I want to question that. Were things really normal before the pandemic? Is that the world we want to go back to? Because as you said, what the pandemic has done is to reveal, to expose the existing inequalities and fractures within our social systems and political systems and economic systems. So we need to understand the urgency to restructure, reconstruct a new language, a new approach, a new world, and hopefully a much more egalitarian world. This is the end of an era, and it's a new beginning. And it is very scary because we are at a crossroads. We could either go in this direction, which will be the direction of more nationalism, more tribalism, more isolationism, in which case we will retreat into our echo chambers and so-called safe zones. And I think this will be a disaster in the long run. Or we will take a more difficult path, but to me a healthier path, in which we will understand the importance of international solidarity. We will strive to think beyond tribes. We will think of our fellow citizens, but also fellow human beings across the world. We will remember that our planet is burning. We are living in a time of climate emergency. We have extremely important global challenges ahead of us, and we need to awaken the spirit of internationalism that is unfortunately at this moment endangered.
I would like to maybe to continue a bit more about your writings and your career and as a novelist, and to ask you if you could also just share with us how your upbringing has shaped and made you feel connected to the experiences and voices that are marginalized and silenced, and how that is reflected in your work.
Yes, I sincerely believe if you're a storyteller, especially if you're a storyteller from wounded democracies, such as Turkey or Egypt, or there's so many actually examples right now, Philippines, Venezuela, Brazil, the list is getting longer and longer every month actually. If you happen to be a writer coming from wounded democracies or broken democracies, you do not have the luxury of being non-political. You know, you can't say, well, I only want to talk about what my stories. I don't want to talk about what's happening outside the window. If so much is happening outside the window, you need to go out and look. And if what you see disturbs your conscience, you need to talk about it. Also, I am a feminist, and one of the many, many things that I have learned from feminisms of past generations is that when I talk about politics, I'm only referring to party politics or politicians. Our personal lives are also political. So when you write about gender, sexuality, this is also a political act if you describe politics in such a broad way. Yeah? Because I think wherever there's power, there's politics. And the reason I mention this is because as a novelist, I do, of course, love stories. I chase stories. I dedicate my life to stories and words and language. But I am equally interested in silences. So not only stories, but also silences. And when I say silences, the things we cannot talk about easily. And I am much more interested in trying to give more voice to people who have been marginalized, disempowered, pushed to the periphery, people whose stories have been forgotten or erased systematically. I want to bring the periphery to the center in my books.
Okay. Well, I just apologize because you probably are not seeing me at this moment. On my laptop, we will be fixing it. But I want to connect to that and to connect to your novels, because we truly get to see life through we get to see life through the experiences of individuals that are considered outcasts in your novels, and be that due to their politics or their gender identities, sexual orientation, or cultural values. And I've listened to a few of your interviews, and I found one thing very particularly interesting, because you talk about how you've had often readers who hold homophobic views come to you and say that I really related with this character in the book, and that character was potentially somebody queer, or xenophobes say the same in relationship to a character who is a minority in your book. So I was curious to ask you, why do you think that happens? Why is it that people will connect with fictional characters, whereas in their daily realities they refuse to accept them, or they see them as a threat?
Yes, thank you so much. It happens so many times. I have readers who come from very conservative families or very nationalistic families, and they grew up hearing only one narrative. And this is the narrative they heard in the family, in the neighborhood, at school, and when they turned on their TV, right? But what happens is, when we read a novel, when we read literature, a story, we are alone. We're not in the company of other people. Literature, particularly the art of the novel, is the loneliest form of art. The writer is alone when we are writing, and the reader is alone when he or she is reading. Now, that loneliness can be very precious, because suddenly we are not influenced by other people. Suddenly we're not influenced by TV or media or advertisements or what our neighborhood is saying. We are alone in our inner garden. And the novel flourishes in that inner garden. When we connect with a story, we are a little bit more ready to open up our hearts and open up our minds. I have many xenophobic readers who have, who grew up with lots of biases and stereotypes against minorities. I have homophobic readers who have heard all these cliches and stereotypes about sexual minorities. But then, as you said, they come and they say, in this book, this is the character that I like the most. And so I ask myself this question, how does it happen? I think all kinds of authoritarianism depend on collectivistic identity. You need to erase individuality for totalitarianism to flourish. Literature is the opposite of that. What literature does is to restore our individuality, not in a selfish way, but in a way that reminds us, I'm a human being, and the person I'm reading about is a human being. He or she has similar sorrows and joys, and actually we're not that different. It enables us to connect with our fellow human beings in a different way than the requirements of the public space in our daily life. And that's why I find the bridges built by literature incredibly important, precious, and even more needed in today's world.
Of course, that is so true, and in fact, that's also one of the ways that we at Kosovo 2.0 see the role of journalism and storytelling in journalism, to make sure that it provides stories that people can relate to, and to provide stories that people can relate to whom they consider as an other. But do you think, in general, in journalism, maybe to ask you, are we doing that enough? Are we listening enough? Or has journalism forgot that emotion and compassion are also important ingredients in storytelling?
I think, of course, first of all, I have a lot of respect for investigative journalism, for journalism in general. And I do believe that, unfortunately, we're living in an age in which journalism is under attack. And it's so important because countries like Turkey show us that for a democracy to exist, elections is not enough. Turkey has elections, and that doesn't mean it is a democracy. For a democracy to survive, in addition to the ballot box, we need other things. We need rule of law, checks and balances. In my opinion, nobody in this life should be extremely powerful. We are human beings, we are fallible creatures. We need to balance each other. So checks and balances are very important, separation of powers. But equally important is free and diverse media. Journalism contributes so much to democracy, diversity, independent academia, women's rights, LGBTQ rights. Together with all those components, a democracy can survive. If the components are broken, just in itself, the ballot box is not enough. So coming back to your question, I think we need to understand how crucial, important journalism is. Sometimes we all get upset at journalists. That's something else. What we need to recognize is the importance of free, investigative journalism, especially in an age like this, in which there's a lot of so-called post-truth. There's a lot of misinformation, right? But I think stories are a very important part of this, because as human beings, we're emotional creatures. And we can only connect with other people if we know their story. Otherwise, we do not feel it. It doesn't register. We don't feel numbers, whether it's 5,000 refugees or 10,000 refugees. The difference doesn't register in our minds unless I know the particular stories of every single person. So we need to share more stories, and I think that is the only way we can overcome this wall of numbness. Otherwise, if we lose the stories, we feel numb, indifferent. And I'm afraid of that. I think that's a very dangerous thing.
And also emotions is something that we see there's a tendency to also manipulate with it, particularly in the more far rights and the more populist tendencies in politics. So there's also this tendency to manipulate with people's sentiments and with people's emotions. So that is also a threat that we are currently seeing, and it does sometimes get its way into storytelling as well. So how do we balance that, and how do we manage that thin line of emotions?
That's such a powerful question, and I think it's so right, because we are living in the age of anxiety. This is the age of anger, fear, resentment, bitterness. And wherever you look, there are lots of negative emotions. On the one hand, it's very understandable that we feel negative emotions because we feel insecure. We don't know what the future is going to be like. Imagine, for my mother's and my grandmother's generation, you asked me about my upbringing. I was raised by two women. When I think about their lives, they have this faith that no matter how difficult life is today, but tomorrow would be more advanced, more progressive than yesterday. That if we had good education, we could build a better future for ourselves. Now, fast forward in the year 2020, who can tell that better education guarantees a better future? Who can guarantee that tomorrow is going to be better than the past? So we have been, it's no coincidence that we are full of lots of anxieties. And every survey shows that the younger generations are actually the most anxious ones, understandably. And I find that very important, the mental health of young people. How do we cope with all these negative emotions? I also find it politically dangerous, because this is exactly when the populist demagogues enter into the picture. They are aware that people are tired of negative emotions. They don't know how to deal with all these negativities and uncertainties. So the populist demagogue comes with false promises of simplicity. The populist demagogue tells us, I'm going to make everything simple for you. I'm going to build a wall. I'm going to divide people into tribes. I'll solve this for you. And many people follow that because we crave simplicity. So I think the more honest approach is, first of all, to share with each other. I'm overwhelmed with negative emotions. Let's talk about our negative emotions rather than try to suppress them. But let's also together find a better way forward rather than following populist right-wing demagogues.
And I think also this is an experience that you've had being from Turkey as well, where there's been attempts to also other you in a way and to make you you've written and spoken about that, this feeling of feeling different, and also attempts to, let's say, delegitimize your voice or to and it's something that I think also here in Kosovo we're very much subject to, because there is always this constant expectation here to put national identity as a primary marker of identification and of self-realization, and any other forms of identity are made to seem or to think of as trivial. So how do you think such experiences can also invoke a desire or a determination to reclaim and redefine a sense of individual agency?
Yes, and that's a very difficult thing, because nationalists tell us, well, if you're criticizing a government, if you're criticizing the authorities, then you don't love your country, then you don't love your people, you don't love your culture. Why? I mean, I might be very critical of politics and politicians. At the same time, I love where I come from. I love the people, the culture, its history. But there are things in that history that I might also be critical of. That doesn't mean you don't love it. So we need to separate these two things, because, again, right-wing demagogues always use this identification. They say, if you criticize the government, then you're against the whole country. That's nonsense. I think it's very important that at the end of the day, we are individuals, we have emotional attachments. We love our cultures, we love, the stories. At the same time, I want to be able to talk about history in a more nuanced way. Just to give you an example, when one of my earlier novels, The Bastard of Istanbul, came out in Turkey, and this is a book that talks about difficult subjects. It talks about memory and amnesia. In Turkey, we come from a very rich history. We have a very long history, but that doesn't mean we have strong memory. We're a society of collective amnesia, and we have forgotten so much of our own history. We have erased it. So the book talks about Armenian genocide and memory and amnesia. And when it came out, I was put on trial for insulting Turkishness. And that was the accusation, even though nobody knows what that means. And it was very surreal, because the words of Armenian fictional characters were taken out of the book and used as evidence in the courtroom. And as a result of that, my Turkish lawyer had to defend my Armenian fictional characters inside the courtroom. And that went on for a year. There were nationalist groups on the streets spitting at my pictures, burning EU flags. And after a year of that, we were all acquitted. When I say we, me and the fictional characters, we were acquitted. So it's very surreal. But the reason why I'm sharing this with you, because in countries where democracy is lost, it is very difficult to think differently. Anyone who speaks differently is immediately, stigmatized as a traitor. We need to be very careful about that. We might have differences of opinion. We need freedom of speech, open spaces. Art, literature cannot flourish if that freedom is taken away.
And how do you deal with such criticism and attacks coming from for your country? I'm just curious to ask, do they also provide kind of a place from which you extract questions to then address through your writing as well? Because besides The Bastard of Istanbul, also other novels have been criticized or attacked for the so-called attacking Turkishness and whatnot. So do they provide a venue for you where it leads to questions and afterwards writing?
Yeah, I mean, of course, it's not easy to question political taboos, but I think it's equally difficult to write about sexuality. It's difficult to talk about gender, and sometimes people don't realize this. I think when you are a women writer or women poet or women journalist or academic, you have to deal with an additional layer of sexism, misogyny, and that's always there. I mean, Turkey is a very patriarchal country. It's a very homophobic country, and sexism is deeply, deeply rooted. It comes from even people you wouldn't expect. Again, last year when my latest novel came out, this time a prosecutor, they wanted to, investigate my books to see if there was obscenity in it, because I write about issues like sexual violence, child rights, or violence against women. Why do I write about these issues? Because these are the realities of the country where I come from. We can't turn a blind eye. And so to me, the saddest thing is, instead of trying to solve the problem, instead of changing the laws, instead of protecting the victims of domestic violence, instead of opening shelters for women and children who are experiencing domestic violence, instead of really doing something about it, the authorities are trying to prosecute or investigate writers who are writing about, fiction writers who are writing about this in their stories. So that to me is very ironic. But how do we deal with this? At the end of the day, I love the art of storytelling, and when you write a book or a novel, you don't really think about how the authorities are going to read it. You just write what you love. And I love this, I love literature.
You mentioned your recent book, 10 minutes and 38 seconds in this strange world. And I think also one of the ways that you got inspired for that book, it's based on a true story of what happened to a sex worker in Turkey. So in a way you're also being fed based, of course, on the current climate and being fed by what is happening around you, and it feeds into how you approach the next issues and topics of your novel. So it goes back to what you were saying, that we cannot afford to be apolitical. So could you maybe just let us know a bit about Layla, the character, the main character of the book, and how she was inspired? And I find it beautiful the way you build the circle of friendship between her and the five, and through each of the characters, they're all outcasts in different ways. And so yes, if you can let us know a bit more about it.
Yes, I think friendships are so important. In the book, I call it our water families. I think we have two types of families in life. We have our blood families, the families we grew up with. And if our blood family is loving and kind and tender, that's such a blessing. But not everyone is as lucky. And in a way, the book is saying, particularly to those people, please do not forget, as you keep living, you're going to have another family, and that's going to be your water family. Our water families are composed of our friends. The number of those friends can't be dozens and dozens, because I'm talking about very close friends, the witnesses of our journeys, maybe 5 or 6 people. But these are the ones who will pull us up when we fall down. So what I've seen in Istanbul is, particularly among minorities, especially sexual minorities, those friendships, those networks of solidarity, sisterhood, are incredibly important, especially when the society is intolerant or when the state is intolerant. Those friendships become even more important. But coming back to Layla, right away in the book, we do know the book is very unusual in its structure, in the sense that right away we know the main character is dead on the first page. And her body has been dumped in a garbage bin, but her mind is still working. As you said, I was inspired. I remember the real incident that happened in Istanbul. Unfortunately, very sadly, a sex worker was brutally killed and her body was dumped in a garbage bin, like the final insult. So I wanted to honor her memory. But of course, the Layla that I created is completely fictional. And I also became very interested in these researches related to neuroscience that show after the moment of death, after the human heart has stopped beating, the mind can function for another few minutes, sometimes up to 10 minutes. So that's a very interesting puzzle for a writer. What happens in the mind of a dead person during those 10 minutes, And that gave me the structure of the book. if I may share this with you, the second idea that triggered the book was an actual place in Istanbul. It's called Kimsesizler Mezarlığı in Turkish, which means the cemetery of the companionless, people who don't have a companion in life. Years ago, I became very drawn to this place because it was such a sad, forsaken, forgotten place. When you go there, it's unlike any other cemetery. There are no marble tombstones, no visitors, no flowers, no names on the tombs, graves, just numbers. It's a place where actual human beings become numbers. And so I started doing research. Who are the people buried here? And then you realize almost everyone who has been buried there has been rejected by their family. Some of them have been rejected because they were LGBTQ. Some of them, there are some abandoned babies there also. Also, there are some sex workers and a growing number of refugees. You know, we do read about refugees who have drowned as they were trying to get into Europe, right? Where are all those bodies taken? They're taken to the cemetery of companionless in Istanbul. So it's a very strange place where an Afghan refugee or a Syrian refugee might be buried next to a Kurdish sex worker or a Turkish, gay citizen or an abandoned baby. And they're all there, turned into numbers. I think as a novelist, I wanted to reverse the process. I wanted to at least take one of those numbers, because in the book, Leyla is buried there. I wanted to reverse the process in the sense that because the cemetery dehumanizes human beings, I wanted to rehumanize someone who had been mistreated and dehumanized.
I would like to connect to, earlier you were talking about friendships and how we have different families and different friendships throughout life, and to connect it to something that you've written and talked about, that there's, when you speak about anti-intellectualism and anti-feminism, is something that is not necessarily discussed that much when we're talking about authoritarian populists today. So what forms of individual and more collective dissent are we seeing in the mobilization of women's rights groups and in the feminist movements as well? Because those are also, I think, connections and groups that that we form throughout life. We're not born into those, we form them throughout life. So what kind of movements and groups are we seeing right now in that regard?
Yes. Of course, especially in the last years, there have been so many articles, books about populism, but I realized there isn't enough emphasis on one aspect of populism, and that is its anti-feminist nature and also anti-minority nature, but also its anti-intellectual nature. Populism doesn't like plurality. Populism doesn't like diversity. When you listen to populist narratives, you will immediately see populism assumes that the people are one monolithic whole, just one big undifferentiated mass. Like everybody has the same opinion. If you have a different opinion, then you're an outsider. That's not reality. In fact, there's diversity of opinions, there's diversity of lifestyles, but populism doesn't like that. What I do observe, and this was the case throughout history, populism also doesn't like when things are questioned. It doesn't like critical thinking. And it's not a coincidence that populism doesn't like books, literature, culture, because literature teaches us, or books teach us, how to think more critically, be more open-minded. None of that is embraced by right-wing authoritarian populism. So I wanted to highlight that aspect of it. And also I think gender is a big part of this. It is not a coincidence that in countries where we have seen a rise in religious fundamentalism, a rise in ultranationalism, and a rise in populist authoritarianism, we have also seen an increase in patriarchy, an increase in misogyny, an increase in homophobia, So it's not a coincidence. They always go hand in hand. Populism likes to promote a certain type of masculinity. Now, when I say that, I am aware as a feminist that under patriarchy, it's not easy to be a woman. But I honestly think it's not easy to be a man either, especially if you're a young man who doesn't conform to that given description of masculinity. If you don't fit into that description, as a young man, your life is going to be very difficult. So I think it's very important that women's movement brings on board young men who also suffer from the straitjacket of imposed masculinity.
That's so important, actually, and something that we share also coming from Kosovo and from this region, because there's often this tendency within the region, which are considered democracies in process or in the making. There's a tendency for the political debate to focus only on what are considered bigger political projects, but issues that are related to human rights, to minority rights, to sexual minorities, and to gender rights are always considered as of secondary or third importance. So first we have to deal with the big political issues, and then we will deal with human rights, whereas they actually go hand in hand, and that's the whole sense of democracy.
Absolutely. You are so right. And like you in Turkey, I have heard this so many times, people saying, both especially from the left actually, saying, yes, okay, women's rights important, but we have more urgent things to deal with. Yes, okay, maybe sexual minorities are important, but we have more important things. So there's no end to that kind of postponement. And also people do not realize that it is actually very connected. Power relations, injustices, inequalities, the way we raise our daughters and our sons as differently from each other, it all starts in the family. It all starts with us in our childhoods. So it's not a matter that can be postponed. And I think gender imbalance and inequality should always be at the heart of our discussions. And today it has become even more important with the coronavirus, the pandemic. I am worried that women are going to suffer even more disproportionately. Even their suffering is going to be even bigger. It already is. Most of the jobs that will disappear after the pandemic are undervalued, underpaid jobs. And these jobs are usually held by women, or young people, or immigrants. So we already know the three groups that will suffer the most from the pandemic. So it is incredibly important that when we talk about the post-pandemic world, we always keep in mind the inequalities and imbalances in mind.
I would like to also connect to something you said earlier about memory and how important also storytelling, how important of a role it plays in memory, because I've also heard you say before that it's a responsibility, which I agree very much with. And in Turkey, and I think also here in the Western Balkans, in Kosovo, there are these attempts to monopolize and capture history and really enforce a singular, linear understanding of history. And this is something that we're constantly here experiencing in Kosovo. So how can history be seen as a process that belongs to diverse voices and that allows for this multiplicity of views? And what is the role of storytellers in journalism and in fiction in this regard?
Yes. I think it's incredibly important and also difficult, but it's vital that we try to understand history can be read in different ways. And this is what exactly official history denies. Again, I'll give you some examples from my own personal life. I was born in France, but I came to Turkey with my mother. I went to school. Most of my schooling was in Turkey. And at school, we would always swallow a very nationalistic interpretation of history that taught us we were a great empire, we had justice and civilization, and wherever we went, we brought justice and civilization. This is what the textbooks say when you go to school in Turkey. I also learned as a child from Turkish nationalism that Turkey was a country surrounded by water on 3 sides and by enemies on 4, that you couldn't trust any other nationality, that the only friend of a Turk would be another Turk. So that kind of nationalistic way of reading history and today is really very problematic. And then only when I started reading novels, I realized, wait a minute, how would I feel had I been born as an Armenian silversmith living in the Ottoman Empire? How would I feel if I were a Jewish miller or a concubine in the harem? How would I feel if I were, a peasant living in the Balkans, or a peasant from different religious backgrounds? How would the reality of the Ottoman Empire seem to me if I were a minority member. And then when you boil it down to those seemingly small questions, when you ask about the individuals in history, then you realize there is no such thing as one big version of history, actually. And it's not a coincidence that in history textbooks, there are no human beings. The only human beings mentioned are sultans and Shaykhul Islams, the people at the top, power elite. But other than that, there are no human beings in school textbooks. What literature does is to remind us, wait a minute, what happened to the human beings and their actual stories? And when you do that, I think it gives us a cognitive flexibility. It gives us more empathy. You realize the same event can be read through different angles. And it's a good exercise for my mind, and it's a good exercise for my soul to be able to look at the truth from different angles. We're living at a very important time in this regard, in which the forgotten stories of minorities, especially with Black Lives Matter today, many people are questioning historic monuments here in the UK too, and they're saying, wait a minute, what about my story? You haven't included my voice in your history textbook.
Well, there's also the other problem, I would say, with history, because there's also the history of colonialism that also has not been in the West addressed as much, and a lot of what we're seeing reactions in the UK are a result of that, but also in the US as well with the statues, and those are also learnings and teachings of history that need to be challenged a bit more, and sometimes they're not as much, maybe.
Yeah, absolutely, you're so right. We need to talk about the legacy of colonialism, the forgotten stories, the stories that colonialistic historiography erased, still to this day. But I think, again, in that regard, it's very important if a country is a democracy or not, because at the end of the day, every nation state has their own official version of history. But in a democracy, we can walk into a bookstore and we can find books that say, wait a minute, you forgot my story. Here's my story. Here's the story of my ancestors. So all those forgotten voices can be found in books. That's why knowledge is so important. But in a place where there is no democracy, it's very difficult to write those books, because the writers of those books will be prosecuted. So all I'm trying to say is, I think in order to understand what official history has excluded, we don't need to look at school textbooks. We need to go to bookstores, to libraries, to books, and learn from each other. And in that regard, our learning is endless. I think we need to keep learning from the minorities who have been oppressed by these grand narratives to this day.
We will be opening it up for questions soon, but before we move into questions, I'm going to just ask you one more, because there's something that I feel very passionate about when I read your books, and it's something that it's come across when I've discussed it with colleagues and with others, is how much commonalities we find in your characters, and a lot of cultural commonalities as well. I think especially this clash, this conflict between very rigid understandings of tradition and what is the so-called modernity, this conflict between private, public, local, global, and so on. So what are your connections to the region, to the Western Balkans, and to these tensions, and how do you relate to it?
The Balkans always, for me, has been incredibly important in my way of thinking and learning. First of all, I feel emotionally attached to the peoples, plural, cultures, but also history. And I think many of the issues that you deal with in Kosovo are very close to my heart, in the sense that, memory and amnesia. How do we remember the past, but also manage not to get stuck in the past? How do we build a better future? How do we embrace diversity, but at the same time, how do we not lose our individuality or our particular culture? How do we balance that with global, or international narratives? So there are lots of questions coming from the region that resonate with me. And it's not a coincidence that when I read poets and writers and journalists or academics writing about the region, I've always felt very connected. Maybe also because my maternal grandmother's mother also comes from very close the area. I also always felt an emotional attachment. But all I'm saying is, not only me, I think the whole world has a lot to learn from the history of Balkans, but also the complexity of the Balkans.
Thank you so much. I will see if we have any questions, either from people here physically or also online. Yes, we do have a question. I expect there will be a few. So just to remind everybody that we have another 10 minutes, so I will leave this space now for questions addressed to you. Okay.
Hello, I'm glad to be able to ask this question as a first, because in your novels, as an architect, I found a few factors that were very, I wasn't looking for them, but they were very based on urban memory, on what the city allows and what it enables for your characters. So I wanted to ask what is the psychology that you base it on the city and its architecture and its urban layout, on the behavioral patterns, and how it compares to the characters' behavior and what they remember. So how urban memory works with your characters, because I found it to be a very important factor in all of your novels.
Thank you so much. I think urban memory is so important. And again, I'm going to mention Istanbul, because even though Istanbul has this very rich history, unfortunately, it doesn't have urban memory. When you walk around Istanbul, you will sometimes pass by a very old building, empty. Nobody knows, because there are no signs, no placards, nothing explaining who lived there. It is sometimes you will walk by a cemetery and the script is in Ottoman. People have no idea who is buried there. But I think what we have lost primarily is curiosity, our sense of curiosity, that almost childish curiosity is so important, just to be able to ask, what happened on this street 50 years ago, 100 years ago? What was the city like? How did people live? How did people treat each other? Memory is a responsibility. And I think urban memory is so important. Just maybe if I may share this with you, in one of my novels, I wrote about the architect Sinan, who was regarded as the greatest architect of the Muslim world. And of course, the cityscape of Istanbul, Sinan built it to a large extent. To me, it's very important to understand that when he was working, he wasn't only focusing on architecture, he was also focusing on urban planning. He thought, about the history, the sense of continuity. We have lost that. Today, it all became about money and greed and, building more buildings and making more profit without any respect for the city's past and pluralism and history and memory. So I find that very, very problematic.
Thank you. We also have a few questions coming in from online viewers. I'm going to start with the first one. It's Luka from Skopje, Macedonia, and she says a great part in gender gap is due to social norms, especially in underdeveloped countries, and it seems like we are not moving forward fast. What is, in your opinion, the main reason for this? Why we're not moving faster?
Thank you so much. Well, a couple of course, it's very complex because patriarchy is complex. But we need to remember that it always starts in the family. How do we raise our sons differently than our daughters? We teach our daughters how to cook and how to clean the table, help their mothers in the kitchens, but we don't expect the same, kind of participation from our sons. So even in that small setting, we start to treat them differently. But on a larger scale, let us not forget, we have, across the region, we have many women who are incredibly vocal and strong characters, right? And they speak up, they speak their minds. So if you look at arts and academia, medicine, in many, many areas, women are actually very visible. But I think there's one area in which women are almost non-existent, and that changes everything, and that is politics. So when you look at politics, local, regional, and national level politics, especially as you move the ladder up, when you look at decision-making levels, those decision-making levels are usually occupied by very conservative men of a certain age, usually religious or nationalistic, but very conservative, usually right-wing, right? And so these are the people who are making the decisions, and that affects everything. We need to see more women in the public space. We need to see more women in politics, and especially in decision-making processes.
I'm going to read now another question, and it comes from Lindon Krasnice. It's a bit long. I'll see if I can edit a bit as I go along. And he says, I'm a huge fan of your work. I'm particularly impressed by your, again, consistency in the duality of intellect and emotion. You mentioned that pessimism must be kept in the mind and optimism in the heart, and the balance between the two is crucial. This reminds me of your passage in 40 Rules of Love, in which you describe intellect as something that tangles everything and risks nothing. And love is that which untangles all and risks everything. How does one keep the balance? So maybe I'll stop here and then see if we have time to continue with the rest of the question.
What a beautiful question. You know, how does one keep the balance? I don't think, honestly, that we can find the balance once and for all, because every day is a new challenge, isn't it? We think we have found the balance, but next week something else happens, and then we realize I'm not balanced at all. But that kind of questioning is a good thing. What I find dangerous are dogmas. What I find dangerous is certainty. People who are very certain, very sure of their own truths, usually become the worst fanatics. People who have an element of doubt, those are the ones who have more humbleness, you know? If we can question ourselves, you know, we think we're doing the right thing, but always keep the door open and say, am I doing the right thing? Am I balancing it rightly? And bear in mind not to hurt other people. I am a big believer in compassion. And we come from cultures in which sometimes people think, well, if you're kind, if you're compassionate, if you show your emotions, then that's a source of weakness. I refuse to believe in that, you know? For me, compassion is strength. So whatever we do in life, we need to bear in mind not to hurt people. But other than that, the challenge is continuous. How do I balance my mind and my heart, my pessimism and my optimism? I think it's an ongoing journey, and in that sense, the learning is continuous.
Thank you. I will read another one coming from a viewer from online. It's from Lura Limani from Kosovo. And she said, I was wondering whether you could share your thoughts on current debates that are happening in the UK, in particular in light of the global Black Lives Matter movement. Is the official narrative of the British Empire being challenged right now? How do you see your own involvement in this decolonization of knowledge as an intellectual?
Thank you so much. Yes, at the moment in the UK, we are experiencing very important debates, not only about the monuments, because the monuments are, of course, symbols, important symbols. I think the crucial question is, what are the symbols that we want to share with our children? What are the symbols that we are proud of as human beings? What kind of history do we want to, what are the stories that we want to remember, but also what are the stories that we have erased in our history books? So these are the questions that the UK, many people in the UK are discussing at the moment. If I may add this, I think throughout the process of Brexit, lots of things changed in terms of our political language in the UK. So the language of politics became a bit more aggressive, a bit more divisive, polarized. And I find that very dangerous. In this new language, people who think differently can immediately be labeled as enemies or enemies of the people. When you come from a country like Turkey, where democracy has been crushed, maybe you pick these things more easily. I think democracy is a culture of coexistence, of sharing, you know, and we have to understand that we might have difference of opinion. That doesn't mean we're enemies. So in that regard, the changes in the language of politics in the UK really, really worries me.
Thank you so much. I'm going to just see if we have a question from the audience here. If not, I'm going to actually move to the last question, which will come from me, because I would like to bring it back to hope. And something that when we chose hope as the theme of this program, we were very much aware of the delicacy of hope as a feeling, because hope in one sense it gives one an assurance for a future, but it might also prolong the present, because it might make solutions seem something that needs to take place in the future. So it might also remove a bit of individual agency from the present, and this was something we were interested in exploring. So in order to ensure we don't remove agency from hope, according to you, what other sentiments or practices should we attach to hope itself, and the way we understand hope and the way we manifest hope?
Mm-hmm. I think the primary thing is we need to be honest with ourselves. How do I feel at this moment in time? If I feel anxious, if I feel fearful, if I feel angry, just to honestly accept those feelings is also okay. We can't feel hopeful always, all the time. But as you very rightly said, we need to also understand how precious hope is. Because if I may share this with you, maybe as a final thought, when I read the memoirs of people who have survived genocides, civil wars, the darkest chapters of human history, when you read poets, writers, people who survived those atrocities, many of them are asking us a very crucial question. They're saying, how is it possible that such dark things can happen? Is it because human beings are evil by nature? Is it because that's who we are? And the survivors say, actually, no, because most human beings, like me, like you, like everyone else, are a combination of good and bad. We have both good and bad inside. There are evil people, but relatively their numbers are small, right? So how is it possible that such horrible things, atrocities, can happen on a large scale then? And the answer that the survivors give is maybe the opposite of wickedness, or maybe the opposite of evil is not necessarily goodness, or in other words, the opposite of kindness is not necessarily, being evil. They're saying maybe the opposite of goodness is numbness, is when we become numb, when we become indifferent, desensitized, when we stop caring about each other's stories. If enough number of people become numb and indifferent, then a small number of evil people can cause lots of damage. So what they're warning us about is, please do not be numb to other people's pain. Let's please not be indifferent to fellow human beings suffering, maybe in another part of the world, but we have to remain connected.
Thank you so much, and that is such a good note to end with, especially if we place it within the current context and the pandemic that we're all going through, and to remind ourselves of that. I would like to truly thank you very much for taking the time to be with us. It was a remarkable experience to have the opportunity to talk to you, and also for our viewers and readers to send you questions. So thank you very warmly from Kosovo 2.0.
I so appreciate it. And hopefully next time I will come in person and we will do this face to face.
We would love to. We would love to.
That would be amazing pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. And just to let our viewers online know is that we will be taking just 2-3 minutes to set up for the next speaker. Thank you for watching and following us until now. And we ask you to remain online and to wait for 2 minutes. Thank you so much.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi, Dr. Vandana Shiva. Hello, my name is Linda Gucia.
Hello.
I'm a feminist sociologist, and I have been given this privilege to moderate today and talk to one of the most important women and influential women of our time. So thank you so much for talking to us, and welcome virtually in Pristina, Kosovo. We are very happy to have you. I will briefly introduce you, and then we can continue.
You will ask me questions, right? We'll have a dialogue, yeah?
Yes.
Is that how it goes?
Yes. I was told that you will have a presentation for 10 minutes, but either way, we will continue.
Okay. No, I can do a presentation for 10 minutes. I just wasn't clear about the format.
Okay. Yeah. Whichever format you'll choose, I would be happy to.
I can talk for 10 minutes, yes.
Okay. So Dr. Vandana Shiva, a world-renowned leader, tireless ecofeminist, environmentalist, scientist, philosopher, activist, author of more than 20 books, Staying Alive, Women, Ecology and Development, Monocultures of the Mind, Biopiracy, Water Wars, Soil Not Oil, Oneness versus 1%, a receiver of contrast prices. You won an alternative prize for Nobel Peace, and the founder of Navdanya, an organization which works for organic farming, biodiversity, and fights for seed sovereignty. Welcome to Pristina. This is a brief introduction to such an amazing person and a work of activism and writing.
It's a joy to join Kosovo 2, dedicated to hope. And I would like to begin by sharing a poem called The Seed Keeper that has given me hope from the beginning when I started to save seeds in 1987. It's a poem from Palestine, and all of us in our different countries and our different cultures have been through violence and divisions and wars and separations, and we are going through a crisis, a pandemic and a lockdown, adding up to be one of the most severe humanitarian crises humanity has ever known. Individual countries went through tragedies, but we are right now going through a global crisis. And this poem that has inspired me all along on hope is a poem I would like to share with you to begin. And then I'll talk a little bit about why I started Navdanya and what I have learned in the last 5 decades of my feminism, my defense of nature. Seed keeper, burn our land, burn our dreams, pour acid onto our songs, cover with sawdust the blood of our massacred people, muffle with your technology the screams of all that is free, wild and indigenous. Destroy. Destroy our grass and soil, raze to the ground every farm and every village our ancestors had built, every tree, every home, every denude the forests and the earth till no insect, no bird, no word can find a place to hide. Do that and more. I do not fear your tyranny. I do not despair ever, for I guard one seed, a little live seed that I shall safeguard and plant again. And it is the seed that gives me hope. Can you imagine in the tiny little mustard seed? It's the life of a mustard plant. And then thousands of mustard seeds for future plants. The seed gives me hope that in life there is an urge to renew, to multiply, to share, to carry on, to not be extinguished. And when I plant a seed, it will grow into a plant if I take care of the soil, if there's moisture. And this is the reason, this economy of abundance that is in the seed, the economy of generative creation that's in the seed, that's also in women. It's also in all human beings. And this ability of life to renew, to reproduce, to be shared, to continue, to be interconnected, in my view, capitalist patriarchy is born of a deep fear, a very deep insecurity, a fear of everything that is alive and a fear of everything that is free. Which is why war corporations like Monsanto, that only till the late 80s were known as chemical warfare companies making Agent Orange, was suddenly trying to take control of the seed. And I was at a meeting in 87 where they started to talk about how they would do genetic engineering, they would take patents and make it global to make it illegal for farmers to sell seeds. And I said, how can you do something so scientifically fraudulent, so ethically wrong? You don't invent a seed, a patent is granted for an invention. How can you claim a patent on seeds? Seeds make themselves. Seeds are what we call allopoietic, they're created. And it is really 400 years ago with the rise of colonialism, the rise of industrialism, that really out of England, where the East India Company was created, a whole new architecture of capitalist patriarchy was laid out, of owning the earth as property, of defining women as pure reproductive machines, of defining nature as dead inert matter. And let me share with you the kind of thinking that was laid out. Francis Bacon is called the father of modern science. He was also the chancellor. And this is what he wrote in a book, interestingly, that he titled The Masculine Birth of Time, as if time before that had been feminine, because we realize we are part of nature, we are interconnected with nature, that we are creative, we are productive, we have freedom and we have the urge to live. And Bacon writes that science should, as it were, torture nature's secrets out of her. And with that knowledge, man should not merely exert a gentle guidance over nature, but have the power to conquer and subdue and shake her to a very foundation. Bind her into servitude, make her a slave. And he consciously said, we have to transform nature from being a nurturer mother, Mother Earth, Terra Madre, into being a common harlot to be controlled. That's why, for me, the violence against nature and the violence against women is interconnected through this regime of defining knowledge, of defining economy, of defining politics and power, of defining property. And all this came together for me in the seed. And I decided I was going to save seeds. That as long as I have one seed, that I will plant again. And that seed will give me 20 seeds, 1,000 seeds, 1,000,000 seeds. There is no reason to give up hope. I decided that year in 87 to fight this new empire. I called it the empire over life, bioimperialism. And I said, you won't get away with these lies, Monsanto. And we wrote laws in India that seeds, plants, animals are not human inventions, therefore cannot be patented. I created seed banks in the communities, retrieve the commons, 150 of them in women's hands. And wherever people have seeds, they're not in debt. Climate change doesn't damage them. They are not growing toxic rubbish, which gets them no value. They're growing nourishing food. And our work now over these 3.5 decades has shown that when you protect the earth, when you protect biodiversity, when you turn to women as the teachers, as the guides of how to do good farming, we can actually feed 2 times the world's population. I've done these calculations for India in a very detailed way. We can grow good nutrition. We don't have to have hunger. We don't have to have poverty. We don't have to have unemployment, because the biggest economy is the economy of care. And the people who have never given up the economy of care, no matter what wars came, no matter what famine came, no matter how much violence they had to face, the economy of care continued in women's hands. And because the economy of care was kept alive, life was kept alive. And as long as life is nourished and nurtured, hope will be kept alive.
Thank you so much for such an encouraging words in the midst of pandemic lockdown. And I think that one of the things that pandemic has made visible is increasing inequalities. I mean, as pandemics grow and spread, it sort of grows hand in hand with other inequalities. And I wanted to go back because I think that pandemic is also somehow overbearing question of how do we move away from this? How what are your thoughts on sort of post-emergency medical emergency? What after? What is post-pandemic scenario? What after? So because we see increasingly increasingly other inequalities being visible now with inequalities. We see that once again, pandemic has made visible that some are more equal than others, especially us in sort of so-called third world countries or global south are now in the face of pandemic are also facing other inequalities and restrictions. What are your thoughts on sort of moving away, or what is pandemic teaching us, and how is it helping us rethink?
Well, the first thing is, as soon as the pandemic really was announced as a pandemic, I did a very quick research and built on my research on food systems and wrote a piece called Ecological Reflections on the Coronavirus, One Planet, One Health, because hundreds of new infectious diseases have been created in the last 30 years as a very inefficient, very greedy agribusiness model of invading into the Amazon to grow GMO soya or into the rainforests of Indonesia to grow palm oil. These forest invasions are the main reason for disease. I basically wrote at that time that the pandemic has been created by a global, non-sustainable food system. 2 days ago, the United Nations issued a report that what's being addressed are symptoms of the pandemic and not the root causes. The root causes are the destruction of ecosystems, invasions into the homes of indigenous people and other species. And they're saying till we stop destroying the natural world, we will have pandemic after pandemic after pandemic. The second very important piece in my One Planet, One Health article, which is available on my blog, it basically shows that who is most vulnerable right now? People who are at the bottom and who are eating bad food. And it increases the risk of chronic diseases, and chronic diseases increase the risk of mortality. So the infection is because of a non-sustainable food system, and the risks of death is because of a non-sustainable and unhealthy food system. Where will we go after the pandemic? That is the issue of, will we have the commitment to hope, to create a future that is healthy for the planet and healthy for people, and protects freedom and the rights of the last person to have food, to have work, to have security. On the other hand, those who have accumulated huge wealth are using the pandemic to create a new empire. If I dealt with Monsanto over the last 3.5 decades to prevent them from having an empire over life, it is the technology barons who are trying to establish an empire over life now. And I'll give you just 3 examples. I'm writing my next little book on these issues. So at the peak of the pandemic, there's a new patent issued to Microsoft in March 2020. And the patent's number is 060606, the world patent. And it's basically redefining us as human beings to be users of their machines, machines to mine our body data and body activity and our brain activity. And having vacuumed our data as if we were mines of raw material, to then manipulate that data, put it through algorithms, and define our value. I would suggest you read this patent and read my blog, which is called My Earth Journey, beginning with saving seeds and now to having to defend our very humanity.
Maybe to connect with this, in the context of Kosovo, we know a lot firsthand about genocide. You have a very important concept, ecocide, and you say it's the same. It's the same coin. It's the other side of the same coin. Could you elaborate more for our audience here in Pristina about ecocide?
Sure. So, you know, we are living beings. We are made of flesh and blood. We breathe air that is given to us by the trees and the green. We drink water that is given to us by our streams and our wells. We eat food that we create with our work, with the soil, with the seed. All of this makes us. And the idea that the earth is dead also defined our bodies as dead matter. So in this period of, actually, when you say, you know, if we say 1 billion people are hungry and another 250 million will be starving to death, every day 300,000 are going to starve to death because of the lockdown, pandemic, and destruction of work. That is genocide. But why is ecocide, which is a crime against the earth, also a genocide? Because we are earth beings. We live on this earth. We are not separate. Those who thought they were masters could pretend they were separate because they could live off our work. They could live off the work of farmers, live off the work of workers. And they could continue to pretend they're outside nature. But if we don't have food, we starve to death. If the soils are desertified and they don't grow food, if we don't have water to drink or it's toxic water, we get cancer and we die. And therefore, ecocide, the violence against nature, crimes against nature, translates into genocide, crimes against humanity, beginning with the most vulnerable. The poorest, the women, the ones who are now being defined as throwaway people.
Thank you. So maybe to go back to feminism, I mean, feminism and women have contributed and helped us think differently, not only about women and gender, and as you said previously, but also about environment. And you have sort of in all your work spell out the connection between capitalism and patriarchy, militarism, corporates. So how does, again, to go back, how does this oppression between, you know, patriarchal oppression go hand in hand with the destruction of nature in the name of profit, progress, and emancipation? And maybe we can elaborate more on these concepts of emancipation and women's rights and environmentalism.
So, 2 things. My own personal life. in the early 70s, I started to see the forests of the Himalaya where I had grown up start to disappear. And then a movement started called Chipko, where women came out to hug the trees and said, you'll have to kill us before you kill the trees. We're going to protect our forests. And after a decade, the forests were protected. I worked on dams and rivers. I worked on agriculture, chemical farming, the Green Revolution. And in everything I found that there's a system that's being imposed on us through colonialism earlier, now through development. And this system is what I recognize as capitalist patriarchy. And that's what I named it in my book, both Staying Alive as well as my book with Maria Mies called Ecofeminism. In writing Staying Alive, I went into the history. I said, why do some crazy people think that a forest is a timber mine? Why do they think the soil is an empty container? Why do they think a river is just a source of energy for a hydroelectric dam? Why can't they see life? And that's when I came up with Bacon's writings. That's when I came up with the writings of the architects of the paradigm and ideology and worldview of capitalist patriarchy. So they are the ones who define nature as dead and inert, but they also defined women as a second sex, who were pure bodies with no brains. And I have, I did a 150-year speech at an American college. And what I like to do is, I like to get familiar. It was a women's college. And I said, let me prepare about the history of this college before I give my speech. And the debates about a women's college were, if the girls are allowed to study, their brains will grow and their uterus will shrink. We were thought of as machines where our only role is reproductive machinery, and therefore our brains had to be discounted. But we are intelligent. We are creative. And my struggle over the last 5 decades has been to not only make women's creativity, knowledge, science visible, but to defend the assault on women's knowledge and economy by a war declared against nature and women and third world people by an economy of greed. You can name it what you want to, but it's basically an extractive machine that extracts the last drop of fertility from the soil, the last drop of water from a river. And now they want to extract our brain functions and our minds. And human beings are being turned into the new raw material, the new mind. This is the feminist struggle for our time.
So do you see...
There was a very famous book called Our Bodies, Ourselves.
Yeah.
The time has come to defend our bodies and our minds, our autonomy and our sovereignty.
So do you see women, so do you see women at the forefront of this paradigm shift that needs to happen so we can address this inequalities and ecological crisis that we are in?
Yeah, very much, for 3 reasons. First, all of capitalist patriarchy is based on the assumption of inert dead matter and unthinking people, stupid people. So women know that our bodies are not inert and dead. They also know when our child gets cancer, that body is in pain. When an old parent of 80 needs our care, we are very aware of bodies, not as inert matter, but as our living system. We are deeply aware of life, and we are not in denial of life. So if for 500 years we have had a war against life, and the big tech guys, the Google is taking patents on our body, and Google has said, we have to defeat Mother Nature. They're scared of nature. They're scared of women. So in this period, women will have to be on the forefront, defending nature, defending our living bodies, defending our intelligence, defending our solidarity, defending our creativity, and most importantly, fiercely defending hope in a future and seeding that hope every day.
Thank you. I mean, the topic of 10 years of anniversary of Kosovo 2.0 is hope. So bringing hope. But previously to this conversation, Elif Shafak quoted Gramsci in saying sort of optimism of the heart and pessimism of the intellect. And I think that very much we are facing also that pessimism of intellect, especially here in Kosovo. As during the pandemic, we also faced, just to give a little bit of context, we faced a power grab of overthrown of democratically elected government. Kosovo is going through a very difficult time with everyday political dramas and political instabilities that are hijacking our attention, but also draining our energy. And then in the meantime, we have these discussions of power, land division between Serbia and Kosovo, which I think ultimately has to do with natural resources, and you talk a lot about natural resources, but also how do you keep, in the midst of all these drama and political instability, how do you keep your focus, and how do you fight back these power that seem overwhelming? And how do you focus on the real thing? Because in Kosovo, while the pandemic is happening and the power grab and all the instability, we also have companies continuing to put our water on the tubes, continuing to privatize our rivers and lakes, and international donors are actually investing in power in power plants just 2 meters away from here. So how do we keep the focus in the real matter and not in the day-to-day political dramas that are happening in our lives?
So, Linda, I wrote this book, Oneness versus 1%.
Yes, I haven't read it yet.
The subtitle is Shattering Illusions, Seeding Freedom. And I think it's extremely important in our times to recognize that we have this one, they're not 1%, they're 0.00001%. 5 billionaires have more wealth than half of humanity. And these 5 billionaires are harvesting the corona crisis and the lockdown. Jeff Bezos, the richest man, became richer by $54 billion during the lockdown by making our shop shut down and increasing home deliveries. And now our schools and universities are shut down, and he's selling his cloud services to our public institutions. A kind of privatization is taking place. When you ask, how do you not get distracted by the day-to-day? The first is, the patterns I have tried to write about in this book will remind you that what Kosovo is going through, India is going through, America is going through, England is going through, Brazil is going through. These we feel because we belong to countries, and we feel this is only happening to us. But when we look at the 1%, we realize it's being made to happen to everyone. And in fact, our leaders are little puppets. They're little pieces on a chessboard. And when the same people put Trump in power, Facebook sold data to Cambridge Analytica and helped him win on a hate vote. Now the exact same people who made him win are saying, let's have no hate for profit. They put him in power, but they now think they've used him enough. They need someone else in power. So our national leaders are puppets in the hands of the 1%. And I think it's extremely important to recognize what's happening in Kosovo is happening everywhere. And that will help you both, A, raise your consciousness to a higher level and elevate your hope to a higher level, But even more importantly, you'll be able to turn around and say, what is the seed I can save today? What's the seed I can plant? Because we've lived through, and you particularly have lived through periods where the state was the protector, yeah? And now the market is grabbing things from the state. But we always forget their communities. We are social beings. We are communal beings. And when we join hands with each other, if I create community seed banks, it's to say, the seed is not mine, it's yours too. Minute we can share seeds, poverty goes away. The minute we can share knowledge, we can start farming. We can start growing our food. And another issue that comes with this is all of these years, hierarchies were created, false superiority, those illusions of false superiority, humans as above nature, men as above women, whites above blacks, some religions above other religions. And these false superiorities and hierarchies also created an hierarchy of work. Taking care of the land was not just primitive, but it had to become obsolete. And the billionaires are all talking about farming without farmers. They want giants spraying from the skies, mega machines, tractors without drivers. That's their vision. We have to turn our back to their genocidal and ecocidal vision. And we have to turn to ourselves, our power, and to the earth. I call this the decade of needing to return to the earth. And I would so love it if some of you could come and see our work, but even if the lockdown is not removed, keep track. From the 7th onwards, I'm going to offer a course on how to return to the earth. What are the concrete steps of creating prosperous economies, healthy economies, where no one goes hungry, no one is a throwaway person? It's totally doable. We've done it for 3.5 decades. And I do hope Kosovo will rise like a phoenix. You have beautiful land. You have rich natural resources. Don't let them be grabbed. Protect them and regenerate.
Very inspiring. How can we work together to dissemble the powers and that lead and grab our land and abuse our land and resources? Because you talked a lot in your books about the war over resources, and ultimately that the wars that we see now are wars over resources. And how do we, and Kosovo has been through a very brutal and criminal, actually, process of privatization of our property and our lands and our goods. How do we go back and reclaim that? How do we
build? Well, there's never a going back. There's always a going forward. And if we were dragged on the wrong path, you can change the direction of the path. I don't think we should think of time as linear. We should always think of directions. There are directions towards ecocide and genocide, which will lead to human extinction. If we don't change in the next decade, 100 years from now, the human species won't exist on this planet. But there is another path of regeneration. And that path of regeneration comes by combining resistance, non-cooperation and civil disobedience, and creative work of doing the real thing, building the real alternatives. I call it the resurrection of the real, because the 1% rules us by creating illusions and making us give up the real for something illusionary. We can only know the real through our own knowledge and our own experience and our solidarity. My talk today at Kosovo 2 is a small beginning. I mentioned I'll be offering a course. If at some point in the future when the lockdown is removed, I hope some of you will come to the Earth University I started at Navdanya. And then from there, things will grow. As I said, you save one seed, the seed multiplies. And we are all seeds of hope. We are all seeds of freedom.
Thank you so much for your invitation. Hopefully, when this goes, this will end soon and we will be able to move. Also, in Kosovo, we don't move as freely as we want to, but hopefully we can move freely after this. You talk a lot about taking inspiration for women and women being in the forefront of this paradigm shifts and women being the guardians of the seeds and the earth. But women have also buried the burden of care, especially in these patriarchal regimes and patriarchal state, and burden of nourishing and caring, and these burden has also that left women vulnerable to, as we see now also with COVID, to violence against their bodies, violence in their homes, and disempowerment. How can we find ways to this burden of responsibility, of nourishment, be actually seen as a value more than the burden?
So the same separation between humans and nature also was turned into a separation between economies. And women were left to do what really mattered, but it was counted as not mattering. Yeah? Women's work was treated as no work. So even today I'll meet women and they'll say, I don't work. And I'll talk about how they run their homes. But it's been defined as non-work. Their knowledge has been defined as non-knowledge. So a large part of my work over these 5 decades has to be not just to make women's knowledge visible, but show it is more sophisticated, more holistic, more systemic, more evolutionary than the knowledge that goes with extraction. When I mine the mountain, I only have to know that the limestone can be used for cement. But when I protect the mountains, as my sisters did, they know that the limestone is an aquifer which gives them water. And these are the knowledges that have helped guide my research and change our policies in this country. We stopped mining in my valley, but my teachers, what is the role of the limestone? Were women who'd never been to school, never studied geology, but they lived in that mountain. They knew the rocks, they knew the water, they carried the water. So care was counted as not valuable, and greed has been rewarded for 500 years, which is why you have 1%. This is rewarding greed. It's basically theft. It's basically extractivism. So I definitely don't believe in treating care as not work. It's a lot of work. 2, treating care work as less important work. We have to make the shift and make the economy of care the only kind of economy. We have to start finding ways to make the exploitators accountable. I did public tribunals on Monsanto, and then they had to sell off to Bayer. But by naming the crime and identifying the criminal, you already not only take power, the power you can exercise collectively, but you take away the false narrative of grandiose, we save the world, we feed the people. Right now, Mr. Bill Gates is the one carrying out this narrative. And he's the one doing most damage to the world. So we need economies of care, but everyone should participate. And it should be treated as the most important economy, respected, valued, protected. And the economy of greed needs restraint. It needs regulation. Very often, if it is leading to ecocide and genocide, it needs to stop because it is a crime.
Thank you so much. Before we have a curfew here starting soon, and before we need to go home, maybe I'll open it up to a public and see if we have questions from the public. This is the question? Oh, okay. Sorry. Technology. With the strength of new technology, empire, a knowledge data economy, what would our relationship to technology have to become so the current potential for global network are furthered?
I think
this is a question. Yes?
We have to recognize that the technology giants are massive monopolies. When talking to you, every bit of my data is being recorded. Google has everything. I know my dear friend Mr. Microsoft, when they don't want me to send a mail, my computers crash. Right now, our website has been pulled down. So I definitely feel we must use tools in the service of democracy and under our control. We should not let the tools become our masters and the new colonizers. This is going to be the contest of the next few years. We have to be able to create, like, when Monsanto wanted to patent seed, I said, no, we'll keep it open source. We'll keep it in the commons. There are huge movements in software on open source software. There are brilliant technology people creating alternative systems that are not under the control of the tech giants. And most importantly, we have to know the limits of tools controlled by those who want to shut down our freedoms and not allow them to get away with it. Laws on surveillance, laws on privacy, we have to become much, much stronger on that, because if we don't, we will continue destroying the earth, and then we'll have a surveillance, corporate, militarized state, not letting us move left, nor letting us move right. And in that situation, the lockdown is a brilliant rehearsal.
Hopefully this rehearsal will, this will bring the illusions down, and we will see more clearly. Hopefully one of the lessons that we have learned from this pandemic is as we see firsthand power grabs, as we see the militarizations of our societies, as we see different countries declaring states of emergency and increasing control over our daily lives in the name of safety and security. Hopefully we will, I think that we are also seeing more clearly now what these obstacles are and how these tools have been also been used to oppress us in the name of emancipation. And in that note, you are very critical of feminist, technocrat feminists, and how they use emancipation, and how, especially when you talk about developing countries and women in developing countries, and these incentive of catching up of women in developing countries, you have made it very visible how the local knowledge is important, and how that knowledge is often not recognized. How do we, in the name of emancipation, also become ethical and careful and listening to the local knowledge? And you have been very, very good on explaining this in your books, but maybe a few words for our audience.
So it's not that women are less. We are not inferior to men. And an illusion and a hallucination that makes it look like that, if we as women adopt that hallucination and say, I have to become like dominating men to be liberated, I am already giving up my autonomy. I am giving up my ability to say, but I am equal. Not only am I an equal human being, I am an equal earth citizen. That is why I have talked about catching up development actually being a violation of the power of women to shape a different path. And because I come from a very rich civilization where we have lovely words, we have one poem that is 1,000 names of divinity. Lalita, the one who plays, yeah? 1,000 names. And the name for women's power to change and act is the name for our movement of grassroots women. And it's Shakti, the power to act. We must exercise our power to act. And someone else tells me I'm dead matter, I'm just a reproductive machine. I'm not going to accept it. I'm going to say, no, I'm alive, I'm brilliant, I'm strong, I will resist your domination, but I will not try to be a shadow of your violence. I will be liberated with our liberation of others.
In that note, and with this hope and with these seeds of hope that you are planting all over the world, we will take that seed and nourish it and carry it and hopefully envision a better future together. So thank you so much for talking to us today, and hopefully we can talk live soon and learn so much about protection of seeds and carry on and mobilizing together in our joint fight to save what's left of our earth.
Thank you very much, Linda. Thank you to your colleagues. It was a pleasure to join you. My love to Kosovo and my love to a future of hope.
Thank you.
Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the last of our talks tonight as part of our Hope Media Carnival. Welcome to those who are here at this amazing venue of Thermokiss that has opened the doors one more time to host a day of discussions and inspiring conversations. We have some people here laying down in the grass and enjoying the evening in a physically distanced way, of course. And we also have some viewers who are at home, and I welcome them as well to this talk. It is our last, and I cannot think of a better person to conclude these 4 days of conversations and inspiring words and inspiring feelings as well. We are going to end this day and this 4-day adventure with Ibrahim Nehme, who is in Lebanon, in Beirut, and who is he's also a friend of Kosovo 2.0 since some years ago. With him, we started organizing our Volume Up program, which was intended to bring voices from different parts of the world to share and understand and explore better the collective as well and the narratives that circulate about it. I would like to introduce first Ibrahim, who is going to be doing a presentation first and telling us about his journey, actually. The first time he was here a few years ago in 2017, he brought us into a journey, so I really invite you to stay with us for a little longer and not go just yet. Ibrahim Nehme is a creator, curator, and writer. He's based in Beirut, and his work sits at the intersection of journalism, activism, and artistic expression. He's interested in producing and disseminating media that raises the frequency of the collective consciousness. Ibrahim's work is invested in building the right media channels that reach the right people in order to create the right impact. And a while ago, when we had him here, we had him to speak about a very beautiful project, The Outpost, which is a magazine of possibilities, as you named it. I will not take a long time to introduce him any longer. I will let him tell us more about what he's been up to for the past few years, and I know for sure that he has a very inspiring 15 minutes ahead for all of us. I see you, Ibrahim, in the darkness, and I suppose this has something to do with the blackouts that are happening in Lebanon.
Exactly. The electricity literally just cut a second before I was let into this. But I have 2 candles, one on my right and one on my left on my phone, so I hope you see me all right. And I'm going to be using some slides in a bit. But first, happy birthday, you guys. 10 years, that's incredible.
Thank you.
I'm so happy and grateful to be here, concluding the day and concluding the festival. For me also, it feels like a closure. You know, I was in Kosovo with you guys 3 years ago, and it feels that at the time you created the space for me to plant some seeds, which in the next 3 years blossomed into the most exquisite of creatures. So really, thank you. And here's to many and many, many, many years of masterful and impactful work to come. So I'm not gonna, since we have a short time, I thought I will tell the short stories of 3 different radio stations. I'm gonna share my screen. Oh. Here. Do you see it?
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. Okay, so the first radio is called Radio Midan, and is a fictional radio station that we invented in 2014. At the time, I was publishing The Outpost, and it was 2 years in, and we somehow started feeling the impact of the narratives we were imagining and putting out. And we wanted to do an issue that explores the impact of the stories we tell on the worlds that we inhabit. So we decided to create this fictional radio and called Radio Midan, and basically really built up the universe of this project. We did the logos, we did the poster, and wrote a manifesto, really built it up. and then ran the story as our cover story. And it was published in the form of an interview between us and the programming director of the station. And through the interview, they kind of told us about the impact that this radio is having on, the Arab region. This was focused on this part of the world. But basically, through doing this fiction and radio and presenting it as such, even though so many people thought that this was real, and they started emailing us after, asking about how they could listen to this radio. But for us, we had just a little mention that in the day that it was in 2020, and that was the only cue that this was fictional. But most importantly for us, I think, presenting the case for a platform through which a multiplicity of voices could be heard, and through this channeling naturally create a force that could resist and could, activate pockets of transformation in the worlds that we live in, was important. And we kind of wanted to push it in a way to say that our stories are important, and what we put out is basically what we reap, and we need to pay more attention to the quality and nature of the stories that we tell about ourselves and the kind of futures that are ahead of us. So that was the story of this radio. And in the interview, the director of the station talks about the kind of impact this radio is having, like the social and cultural impact through the variety of programming that's on show. So that was the first radio, and then I stopped publishing the magazine, and I was invited to curate Mansion. This squad turned into an artist space in Beirut, and they gave me 6 months to activate a cultural program in the space. So what I decided to do, instead of activate like a series of different projects, I proposed setting up a radio project and then channel all our activities and energy through that platform. My intention was really to plant the seeds of Radio Midan, and somehow through the working with the community, see it grow. But the project took different turns, and somehow it didn't pick up, at least in the way I was envisioning it in the beginning. And in the end, I was somehow running out of time, so we decided to do this community kind of like game where everyone was needed to pitch into 24 hours of programming, which we kind of curated and created and generated in 7 weeks, and then we presented this radio, or the 24 hours of programming, in the end, and we did a party, and it was fun. But for me, it was something was missing, because the voice did not manage to break through. And in my research and also in the story of Radio Midan, like that fictional story, I'm really interested in the tipping point of when voices and murmurs and undercurrents kind of break through the mainstream discourse. And what happens if our voice becomes part of the dominant culture? What impact might it have on the culture and society, and eventually on politics and economy? So I finished this, and I went to Kosovo, as I said in the beginning, and there I started experimenting. Like, I did like a series of workshops, if you remember, that activated some of the ideas I was working with. But then I want to take you to the third radio and somehow make the case. So the first Radio Midan was in 2014. This Radio Mansion happened in 2017. And then in March of this year, 2020, during the pandemic, at Mansion, the same place, a group of the community decided to start a live radio from the space to talk to one another, to stream their music, to stream the voices while they're being confined to their houses. So it was really a space for them to hear each other out. And so they launched Radio Al Hayy, which means neighborhood. And then a week after, a number of I think like 4 or 5 other radios in different parts of the region and also in Berlin and in France were inspired by this attempt, and they started radios on their own in Tunis and in Palestine and in Berlin and in Paris and in like other places. But for me, the most impactful of them all, this was Radio Mansion and the work that we did, and then anyway, so Radio Al-Hara from Palestine, I think broke through first for their really striking visual language and for the intensity of the programming they managed to put on in such a short time. And just yesterday, actually around this, at the same time that you were having your festival, it concluded today, Radio Al-Hara were organizing a special 3-day, 75 hours of programming where they invited so many artists from around the world to participate, and they're using this program as basically to oppose Israel's annexation to the West Bank and Trump's peace plan. So it's their way of resisting through music, through sound, and through alternative storytelling. And just yesterday, I was listening at 8 p.m. There was a set for Nicholas Jar. They had really huge names on the lineup, and I was down by the sea listening to the set. And at some point, he was interjecting it with his voice, like he would chime in and start talking about the socio-political context of his music, and he shed light on the water politics in Palestine and how Israel is diverting the water of the Jordan Valley and basically depriving the Palestinians of their natural right to water. And he was using basically his music to tap into geopolitical conversations that are timely and important, and just important in the way they may shift people's perspective on this important topic. So, wait, let me end this. How do I do this? Okay, I'm gonna stop sharing. Okay, you see me?
Yes.
So yeah, I wanted to share the story of the 3 radios because I find that, like taken together, I mean, the journey of these 3 projects, even though they're super independent and they happened at like 3 years time difference among each other, I find their journey is a story of hope, which you guys are focusing on and been talking about these 3 days. And I think by telling the story of these 3 radios, we can uncover 3 grounds for hope, for me at least. The first being that change is really very rarely straightforward. It's often, as Rebecca Solnit says, it's as complex as chaos theory and as slow as evolution. And change takes time. Like the vision that was planted with that fictional story in 2014. And then in 2017, when a seed was planted, and then 2020 when it blossomed into the most incredible of forces. And change really takes time, but the fact that we can't measure it in linear vocab, it doesn't mean that it's not happening. So I may have presented this story in a linear way, but the process through which this ended up manifesting in the world is not linear in any way. And I think hope comes from knowing that nothing in our attempts and trials have been lost, because they will come around in some way at some point. And I think this is crucial. The people who laid out, the activists who laid out the seeds in the 1800s for the anti-slavery movements, our ancestors are rejoicing today when they see what's happening with the Black Lives Matter, which was something that was completely inconceivable in their day and age. 50 years ago, marriage equality was not on the radar of most people. Change takes time. to happen. And I think the story of these three videos somehow illustrate this. The second thing is that culture changes politics and not the other way around. And if we look at the lineup that these guys have managed to put together and the voices that they managed to bring as a collective opposition to Israel's policies as a force, and my vision, or the vision that was laid out with Midan, is that this force of resistance through alternative storytelling can eventually grow over time. Like it's like a forest. The more you take care of it, the more it gives. And so the more voices we channel into this platform or these platforms, the greater our voice becomes. And eventually it gets to a point where it can impact the culture that we consume, or the culture that we create, like what films and what books, we could write, and what music we can make that could capture the energies of this new momentum. And can this eventually become a new spirit that shifts or reprograms the consciousness of humanity? So this is two, and finally and very quickly, what these stories tell us or show us is that we are many and we are together, and our togetherness is a force to be reckoned with. And what happened with Radio Hal the past 4 days is a true testament to this. And finally, I think I'm almost done. Finally, I just want to share a quote from a speech by the Subcommandant Marcus, who was the leader of the Zapatistas movement in Mexico. He said, "We are united by the imagination, by creativity, by tomorrow. Health to you, my comrades. Hope. Don't forget that hope, like flowers, is harvested." So yeah, these are the stories of the three radios, and I just realized I look like a pirate with the light and just one eye. This is my take on hope tonight, and yeah.
Thank you, Ibrahim. That was beautiful, and maybe there is some romanticism to that darkness, but I would be idealizing a very difficult situation as well in Lebanon right now. I actually want to go back to recover a bit this idea that you have connected here through the radios. The first radio is a fictional, it's a created dimension where there is a radio that it's even managing to dismantle some government. But then we go to the third radio, which is real, and it's also connecting to Palestine. And it's a reality, and it's bringing people from all over the world to connect to an actual place and speak about narratives that are neglected or shut down. And I want to go back now to something that you told me 3 years ago, when you were here in Pristina, and it connects with this idea of change starting in the imagination. And it's something that you were answering to a question about how to push the narratives that are neglected forward into the mainstream. And you said if you look at civil society movements throughout history, from the movements to abolish slavery or LGBT, the LGBT movements, women and other minorities fighting for their rights, what all these movements have in common is that they all began in the mind.
Of course.
And I would like to connect here with our theme of hope. It's also connecting to the magazine, a magazine of possibilities as well. This is how you labeled it. What is the risk of hope here when you look at it? We have spoken a lot about hope as something that could leave us stagnated and just imagining. But how do we push forward this? How do we push forward this narrative of impossibility? These narratives that tell us that it's not possible to change.
Just ignore them. As simple as that. You know, I think, what's this quote by Buckminster Fuller, who said, if you want to change the world, don't fight existing reality, go create another reality that make the existing one obsolete. And I think this is what interests me in the kind of work I do, that there's this space for a new narrative to emerge, and eventually, if more and more and more and more and more and more and more people join in, this narrative stops being a narrative that is circulated underground, but becomes a voice that can resist and change and be reckoned with. And I find that you can only do this by stepping away from the conversation or from the mainstream conversation and proposing a whole new conversation to be had. Because the media environment is so toxic, like nowadays, in the ways it perpetuates stereotypes and wastes resources, and just perpetuates this hateful energy. And I find that we just need to create. We just need to imagine a new. I was telling you yesterday in our conversation that I'm not interested in doing journalism that reports on what's happening. I'm more interested in the kind of journalism that is more about what could possibly happen or how we could imagine new futures, like the kind of journalism that could take us out from our miseries and existing realities and just plant us in a new possibility. And I don't know if I answered your question.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of also what we have been talking, it's resistance, and I think hope and resistance are as well very connected. I would like to connect, if I may, to the context where you're speaking from as well in Lebanon. And when we speak about resistance, we speak about mobilization, but we also speak about resistance in many other ways. And I was wondering, the situation in Lebanon, you had protests since October. You've been having protests for months, seeking change, seeking different forms of change in many different ways: cultural change, change in reforms of government, political change, social change. And I was just wondering, this is not the first time that Lebanon society goes out in the streets and demands change in such a way. It was also a wave of protest even some more years ago. And it might look like all of those waves of protests might be shut down eventually, and hope is also shut down. I would like to ask you, what is the sentiment after these protests have taken place? Some changes might have happened. Then there is a pandemic that shuts down perhaps this conversation in some way. Has this also shut down the sentiment of change, of hope for a different reality? And how are you seeing people moving forward?
I mean, obviously, I'm not going to be a denier of reality. There's a huge crisis raging outside, and a lot of people feel that they have lost or have been defeated because just 6 months ago they felt that they were on top of the world and victory was really this close, or at least in their heads, in our heads. But then this was, the revolution took different turns, and then the pandemic happened and the economic crisis hit, and it's really, really strange times we're living in. But for me, I don't think anything that happened in October, in October, or the attempts that happened before, when we went down to the street to protest different things at different times, I don't think any of these attempts go to waste. And to quote Walter Benjamin here, came across his quote today that says, and I knew you were going to ask me this question, so I wrote it down: nothing that has ever happened should be regarded as a loss for history. And I think going even back to the story of the 3 radios, you know, you could, if I stopped at the story of the second radio, you could have felt some hopelessness because it didn't really bring this vision to a full fruition. But then this energy kept on pushing because it somehow wanted to, you know, be heard. And I guess what I'm trying to say is that these are accumulations that are important. And for example, like when I came to Kosovo, remember 3 years ago, upon my arrival, when I arrived, there was the Pride Parade happening. And people were so joyous and rejoicing the fact that this is happening for the first time. And it was inconceivable at the time, or at the beginning of this decade, to imagine that Kosovo would be having its Pride maybe a few years later. But this goes again to the fact that minds and hearts change over time, and what changes them is the cultural output. And even going back to like the slavery movement, and it was really culture. It was like the sermons and the voices and the articles and the books and the various forms of you know, artistic output that helped in changing the views of the popular culture or the mass of people towards slavery. And I think we are against such an insane forces of oppression that this is gonna, like, people who expect that change is gonna come overnight, it's just like unrealistic. We are against such a powerful machine that this might take, it might not even be on our lifetimes, but I think this is also what should keep us doing the work that we do.
Mm-hmm. Ibrahim, I will ask if we have any questions in the audience here. We have not much time left because in Kosovo, in Pristina here, we have a curfew until starting at 9 o'clock, given the pandemic circumstances. So we have very, very short time left to speak. It seems that there is no questions from the audience, so I will only ask you something, maybe briefly. You constantly tell us that change starts in the imagination, and a lot of the work you do is precisely allowing us to imagine. So if I may end with these questions, what do we need to imagine as broadly as possible and without limitation? What do we need to get rid of? Or what do we need to break within our system?
What a great question. And I think this needs much more than the time we have. But I think very shortly, I think we need to reprogram everything that we have been taught at school and at home when we were kids, and by society when we were growing up. All ideas of right or wrong, and you know, those notions and ideas that end up trapping us instead of liberating us is what stands in the way of our imagination and of hope, because to imagine is to hope. And so yeah, I think yeah.
To imagine is to hope. So with these words, I thank you very much, Ibrahim, for joining us from Beirut, from Lebanon. It's been a pleasure to be in touch again, and hopefully we have you here again soon, visiting and sharing your inspiring work. And if you let me, I will also please stay with me to end this festival, since this is our last conversation. Thank you, everybody. Thank you to all the people who are here and to all the people who are... Oh, people are clapping here, so yes, please. You cannot see or hear, perhaps. But
thank you so much, Christine, and the entire team. Really, truly, thank you again for this great opportunity to be with you on this super special day of yours. Yeah, here's to more to come.
Here's to more to come. And yeah, to close this, thank you, a big thank you to all the people who've been helping to make this festival possible, from the people here behind me, behind the stage in the technical area, with sound and live streaming, which are allowing also viewers to watch not only from Kosovo but from other countries in the world. There is no pandemic that will stop us from hoping. So yeah, thank you everyone. It's been an amazing 4 days of talks, inspiring conversations, Q&As. We've had people like Mona Al-Tahawi, Elif Shafak today, Vandana Shiva, Jacqui, Banaszynski. We had people throughout these days. We still have a workshop as well going on with Elif Shafak until early this week upcoming. We've had 4 days in which we've been able, at least for as much as we could in the public space, but also reclaiming the online dimension, which is now our part of our daily reality, and we're not going to stop working to continue sharing and connecting. So thank you also to our supporters and the Kosovo 2.0 team that's made all of this possible and put a lot of effort to make you also part of it. Thank you. Did I forget to say? Whoa.